Justin. I am the District Operations Manager for the Colorado State Conservation Board, and this is our monthly coffee hour. Today we have Justin Beall. He's a conservation social scientist at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, and he'll be presenting plans for new research on spatial prioritization of conservation efforts. The research team plans to integrate a variety of data layers, including models of bird populations and habitat suitability, insights from conservation district professionals, and feedback from individual landowners. So thank you guys for joining us, and thank you so much, Justin. I'll let you take it over.
Thanks so much, Raquel, and thank you all for being here today, and thank you for letting me come and present at this coffee hour. It's great to meet folks and also to be able to talk a little bit more about the work that we're doing. And I appreciate that introduction. And one thing that I will say as a disclaimer, I am a recovering academic. So basically that means that I may use some jargon throughout this presentation on accident. If I do, if there's anything that you want clarity on, feel free to stop me, or if you want to wait until the end for any clarification, please do. But I will do my best not to go into academic jargon land with this, which I've done maybe a poor job in some of the descriptions and the titles. But um, my name is, as Raquel said, Justin Beall. I'm a conservation social scientist at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, which is a nonprofit based out of Fort Collins, Colorado. Though we, through partnerships and through some of our own work, engage throughout the Great Plains region. So kind of that circle that you see here on the first slide, that outline of that region from Canada throughout, that central area of the US down into Mexico. So our geographic scope is pretty broad. And traditionally, BCR has been working on, bird monitoring, habitat suitability, models of, um, predicting areas where birds are most likely to breed in a certain area, those types of things. And I am the first social scientist hired on at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, so I'm sort of charting new territory here, which is both intimidating and fun, and exciting. But I am talking a little bit about the work that I was initially brought on to help out with. So this is sort of my first project that was conceptualized, and I was originally hired to work on. So. Some of these slides will be borrowed from a presentation from more of the ecological side of things because I do want to have that perspective as well. But this is ongoing work. I have not collected these data yet, and in fact, I'll be talking about ways that the conservation districts can help with this work and ultimately, I think, help bird conservation and support farmer and rancher livelihoods as well, which is kind of a core aim of what I want to do at BCR and the organizational mission as well. So kind of diving into the background a little bit, um, to give some context, back in 2019, this paper by Rosenberg came out. I want to say it was published in either Nature or Science, and this was sort of this, bombshell that was dropped on the bird conservation community. And what you can see here in these graphs are showing from 1970 to 2019, how have bird populations in the US declined? And they looked at several different types of birds species, so categorizations such as aquatic birds, grassland birds, forest birds. And what you can see from these graphs here is that there's one that's steeply declining far more than the rest. That's sort of that brown line that is going down toward the bottom of the graph there. And those are grassland birds. So grassland birds in total have declined by 60% in that time period, and that's a loss of 700 million individuals, with 75% of grassland bird species in decline. So it's kind of crazy to even wrap your head around that, but it's massive. And so this paper was sort of a huge wake-up call to the community, spurred efforts that we are conducting at BCR, spurred the formation of a new nonprofit called Road to Recovery, and that was for all the bird species, not just grasslands. But I think this can show you sort of the scope of the problem that we're dealing with. It's an urgent issue, and we need immediate action to help conserve grassland birds and prevent many of these species from extinction, I think. Um, and so these agencies, NGOs like ourselves, other groups are working, obviously with limited resources, across a very vast geography. So just the area of core grasslands, so grasslands that are still intact, is about 185 million acres, which is roughly the size of Chile. So I think this underscores the need to really focus in on key areas where conservation is likely to be successful, or maybe those areas where conservation is almost ready. Those areas are almost ready for conservation, but we're just missing a few key things like buy-in from landowners, or some key resources, or removing some key barriers, and then we can engage in that meaningful work to protect birds and other species as well. Um, and so this initial effort was conducted by the Central Grasslands Roadmap, which is in part coordinated by Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, but it's a large effort spanning multiple organizations and countries, and we're just one part of that puzzle. But in collaboration, we created this map that shows these different categorizations of grasslands across the geography that I mentioned. So in green, you see these core grasslands. So these are areas that we might aim to protect and conserve, or preserve, I should say. These vulnerable grasslands are in yellow. So these are grasslands that are currently threatened by, for instance, woody plant encroachment. And we might aim to help address those threats to preserve those grasslands as well. And then finally, in purple, you can see this is converted grasslands, and this might be in crop cover or developed. But this isn't a lost cause because obviously we have programs like Grassland CRP that might put these lands back into grass. And so this is kind of like it's very helpful, but it's a very broad scale approach that just categorizes these different grasslands. So the next rational step or logical step for bird conservation is to look at spatial prioritization, or sort of the key areas for specific birds within these categories of grasslands. And so I'll give a disclaimer that I'm officially leaving my subject area expertise. I am a social scientist, not an ecologist, but I do think these maps that I've borrowed from the bird savvy folks in our organization kind of show the value of looking at these different metrics within that map that I showed you previously. So you can see that depending on what we're looking at, population density, where these populations are most present, things like population growth rate, those areas where they contribute more to the growth of a population. And then this one on the right, relative contribution to population growth, can show very specific areas where we might want to prioritize bird conservation. A lot of these metrics are sort of aggregated for 17 key grassland birds that are in most decline. But we can also break these out for specific species as well. And so, went a little too far there. Let me just make sure we're on the right slide. Yes. So traditional prioritization would take this kind of initial map here, and then within these specific grasslands, we might focus in these core and vulnerable grasslands, and then further look at those areas where birds are most at risk, right? And that's where most efforts previously have stopped. So we'll take these data layers that examine these different characteristics of landscapes that contribute to bird conservation, and then that will be it. But there are these other variables at play where we might be missing part of the puzzle, right? We can't always assume that we can walk into an area, even if it's important for bird conservation, and just immediately be able to do the work or help landowners engage with voluntary conservation measures. So there's climate is another piece of this that I'm not going to talk about because that's not my wheelhouse, but the social data layer is what I'm really interested in, um, and what I've been tasked with developing as part of my role at BCR. So taking that social data layer and then giving it to the ecologist so we can merge it with the bird data layer and see kind of where those areas of conservation readiness, which I'll talk about on the next slide, and where those areas where we just need to maybe, engage with some interventions or some outreach to try and remove those barriers or increase support for conservation. And so the framework that we're using for this is called the Conservation Readiness Framework, which came out of the sagebrush biome, but is, I think, very relevant here as well, by Wallenstein et al., 2024. And basically, it suggests that areas that are conservation ready are areas with high social capacity. So here we're classifying that as basically sort of a strong willingness to engage in conservation among members of a community. In this case, we're looking at the district level. Those areas of ecological importance. So those are areas like I showed you on the previous slide from those bird maps. So kind of those key areas, depending on what metrics you're looking at. And then finally, we have conducive administrative conditions. So this could be things like financial resources for cost share or access to personnel who can help you implement conservation practices on your properties, so on and so forth. And so, in theory, at the intersection of um, these metrics are those conservation ready areas, but you can also think of, areas with low social capacity but high ecological importance and high administrative conditions or conducive administrative conditions. You might just need to raise social support to kind of uh, get that district or community to that level that is conservation ready, just as one example. And you can imagine some other iterations of this as well. And so this is our study area. So pretty much that's that map that I showed you earlier, that classification of grasslands. Any county that touches that map is considered our study area within the US. Unfortunately, because of some limitations associated with both our grant and human subjects research within our timeline, we're not able to go into Canada and Mexico most likely for this effort. So we're just focusing on the US. And as you can imagine, this is a daunting task to try and estimate support for conservation within this entire geographic area. And so the original idea was to do this with an individual landowner survey. And part of my, one of the first things I said when I came in as a social scientist was, we're not going to be able to do an individual survey to get what we want from this. And in fact, we need like $1 million to conduct. I'm not even joking, like literally $1 million to conduct a survey of the scope needed to estimate these at the county level. So far beyond the resources that we have. So, we've talked with other folks within the conservation social science community about ways that we might get at this within our resources. And one of our collaborators had a really great idea. She said, well, these conservation districts, whether or not it's the district manager or somebody on the board, there's somebody within the conservation districts that will likely be able to estimate, with some level of uncertainty, but still provide an estimate that can be useful, the level of sort of support for conservation measures within a county. And so that's where the idea came to ask the conservation districts about level of support so we can get this large scale landscape approach that we originally wanted. And so that's sort of where this effort comes in. And what we're planning to do is sometime in September, send out an electronic survey to all of the conservation districts in that map that I just showed you. And ultimately, we want this to be very short because I know that district managers or board members are busy, obviously, and we don't want our survey to be a burden. And we also want it to be informed by the districts and by the associations, whether or not that's the state level associations or the National Association of Conservation Districts. So we're making sure that that aligns with, sort of the on the ground reality, but also making sure that we're asking questions that make sense. And so our idea is to send it out to all the districts and then basically let them decide, who is the person who is most capable of making this estimate within each district. And so we would ask you for a variety of different behaviors. We're not exactly sure how we're going to categorize them yet, but perhaps categories of behaviors like cost share, um, conservation easements, prescribed fire, those types of things. What is your estimated willingness on a scale from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7, from not at all willing to extremely willing, on average for the county? And this will allow us to kind of understand relative from county to county, what does that willingness look like? And then also a really important part of this would be ranking the barriers faced by landowners, so that, we can understand in the future if we do want to go into these communities and there's this really key bird habitat. But there are these barriers that landowners face to implementing conservation on their property. What are those barriers and how might we address them? And so I had mentioned earlier conducive administrative conditions. So we do want to capture that as well. So what I just talked about was sort of that social capacity piece, or what we're calling conservation intentions. And now, we have the ecological maps, and now I'm talking about the administrative piece. And so one way we might get at this, we're looking in other ways as well, but this is sort of our best option so far, is to use these data that are available from the NRCS Financial Assistance Data Viewer. So basically looking at, over time within these counties, and I just have Colorado here as an example because it's the most relevant. Um, where have these measures been implemented in the past? And that might be indicative of the presence of funding for cost share, and it might be indicative of the presence of personnel to help with cost share. Hopefully, we can find some other data sources to make this a little more robust, because obviously, just because conservation measures weren't implemented or financial assistance measures weren't implemented in an area doesn't necessarily mean that that area doesn't have resources. But this may be a proxy and maybe some indication of that measure that we're trying to get at. And so ultimately, what we want to get is something like this. And this is simulated data. So I just completely made this up for the purposes of illustration. But we can you think about that diagram I had earlier, those three circles, and each one of these kind of corresponds to a different circle. So conservation capacity would be, those administrative conditions that I talked about. Conservation value in this case is, that value for bird species, which areas have the highest conservation value. And it necessarily won't be at the county level, but we can overlay different metrics. I just kind of have this as an example. And then this will be at the district or county level, conservation willingness, and that's that social part that I'm asking about in the survey. And ultimately, what you could do, I think, with this map is kind of look at a county that, for instance, if you just wanted to go in and do some work immediately related to bird conservation, an organization could find those areas that are orange to yellow on all three maps. Or if you wanted to find those areas, you have some key area for bird conservation, that you just need to work to increase willingness, then you could see where those areas on the conservation capacity and value maps that are yellow to orange but maybe purple for willingness. You could work with outreach and engagement and communication within those communities to try and increase support for conservation. And you can kind of see how you would use this for different iterations. I won't go through every single possible combination, but you can see how these maps together might be useful. And then you could also create, a single index. This is probably what we'll do as well to get this broad scale approach where, we combine conservation willingness and value from the ecological data and capacity all together into a single index. And those counties that are high on all three of those, or districts that are all high on all three, would show up kind of in this yellow color. And again, these are just simulated data for illustrative purposes only. And so, the implications I think go a bit beyond that too, and we hope to expand this work in the future as well. So I've kind of already talked about how we might identify those key needs within each district to support bird conservation. But we could also break it out too, because we'll have different layers for bird species, and we'll have different answers for each voluntary behavior. So for instance, if there's a bird that's really responsive to prescribed fire, we could take that map for that bird species and then overlay it with the willingness map um, for prescribed fire, and so on and so forth for every different bird species and every conservation behavior. And also we plan to make these data available for other projects and other potential data layers. So obviously there are folks working in species, beyond birds, and they have their own ecological data layers for what are the key areas for big game species. And so in this sense, I think, these efforts are relevant for each and every conservation district, because ultimately, even if there's an area that's not super key for the bird species that we're looking at, we'll pass these data along, and then certainly there will be implications for those counties for other species, as there's conservation value in every single district, obviously. And again, I just want to reiterate that, hopefully this prioritization will help support landowner livelihoods while supporting bird conservation, because I think it'll really highlight those areas where resources are most efficiently allocated, and maybe, highlight those areas where resources are most badly needed by landowners. And so in that way, I think these efforts could be really, um, you know, really beneficial to both landowners and birds. And so that's sort of the effort I'm most focused on today, but I will take a moment to talk briefly about this individual landowner survey. So we are still going to have an individual landowner survey, but we are not trying to make that inference to the Great Plains. So we're only going to be looking at specific counties that BCR works in, or that are really key for bird conservation, and then having a similar survey for individual landowners. Um, Mainly so that we can build this tool to measure conservation intentions. And then hopefully over time, we can give that tool to folks who are working in other counties and maybe even in Canada and Mexico. We're having some conversations about that now. And then you can get that really robust measure of conservation intention or willingness at the county level from those intensive survey efforts. Um, but still really valuable, I think, to have this large scale approach from the conservation district so that we can start engaging in this work and later have that validated, I think, by these individual surveys. And one thing I'll mention too is a lot of times landowners for these types of surveys will reach out and ask if these surveys are legitimate, and if you've heard of them. So if you get a landowner asking about a survey from Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, that's us. And that will be launching probably this individual landowner survey would probably be launching sometime in early winter, if I had to guess. So that's when you might expect some contact about that. And so with that, I think we have time for questions. If anybody has any, I'd be more than happy to take those.
They're gonna let you off easy.
Looks like.
Well, and if we end the call and you guys come up with any questions, you can email them to me and I can get you in touch. This meeting is recorded, so I'll be sending out the recording to all the conservation districts shortly after, probably later this afternoon. Justin did put his information in the chat and I can share that in the follow-up email too. But if last call, if nobody has any questions, um, I'll stop recording.
Either I did a really good job or a really bad job.
I think it was the good job.
Thanks.
Yeah, Justin, this
Is
is
that Maggie?
Maggie Hanna. I'm in this capacity as the Central Colorado Conservation District. But I am curious beyond the scope of the survey, if you have thoughts on how the districts can better engage with other conservation NGOs or agencies.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that I have a great answer, and I think part of that's just because I'm really new to this context, and I'm still just kind of learning about the various actors at play within the conservation landscape within this region. Um, but I think like opportunities like this are a great kind of first step in that direction. I think interfacing between BCR and the conservation districts and kind of working together on projects like this might be a way to sort of set the stage and um, make some initial connections. Um, but anything beyond that, I feel like as I learn more about this context and kind of the different scope of work between NGOs in the area and the conservation districts, I hope to have better insights about that over time. But I think it is a really important question, and I hope to over time have a better answer to it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm going to stop recording.